Now on to the second session. In this session, we are going to look at the three main development approaches that have emerged as a way of addressing gender equality and women's concerns. We are going to list some of the strategies each approach adopts and identify the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. So, Esther Boserup, who was an economist, wrote a book in 1970 titled Women's Role in Economic Development. What that book sought to do was to show the productive potential of women, which was being ignored. She looked at agriculture and she discovered that women were involved in agriculture, but that this was not being recognized and taken advantage of to improve development outcomes. And so she and a number of women pioneered research into women's roles in economic development and contributed immensely to the Women in Development approach. So the WID approach was adopted in 1975 at the first World Conference on Women. Governments were asked to create national machineries to promote and oversee efforts at the national level to advance women and women in development units. The aim of WID was to integrate women into economic development in two main ways. They were supposed to improve the ways in which women did work at home, reproductive labor issues, by creating appropriate technologies. So in Ghana, for example, we adopted gari processing factories. And the idea is that if you have a gari processing factory, then you no longer have to make gari at home and take up so much of your time. This can be done outside the home to decrease your burdens. Increasingly in Ghana now, we have fufu pounding machines. So people cook their cassava and their plantains, and then they take it someplace for it to be pounded instead of expending their time and energy pounding the fufu. If you do that, then it means that you have extra time on your hands now to focus on your productive labor issues. And there also, the idea was that women would be helped to be able to improve their income earning opportunities by providing loans if need be to ensure that that happened. So the WID approach is grounded in modernization theory, or the idea that if you industrialize your nations, then your countries would develop. What has been said about the inappropriateness of WID? A number of things. One is that women in the WID approach are treated as a homogeneous group, as one group. This approach does not recognize that there are different kinds of women based on their class, their levels of education, or their ethnic backgrounds. Also, these projects do not take women into account to understand their needs or allowing them to take part in the programs that have been developed as part of the WID approach. We also argue that because the WID approach is grounded in modernization theory, it assumes that Western strategies are those that are going to produce outcomes that are good for women and men in our part of the world. Such an approach ignores indigenous knowledge and what it is that we as Ghanaians, as Africans know, and how that can contribute to development efforts. Also, this approach sees the government as the institution that is going to focus on development, as the institution that will solve the problems that women have, instead of recognizing that sometimes it is actually the government, the state, that is making it difficult for women to be able to develop. Now, in the second half of the 1970s, a new approach developed known as the WAD approach, the Women in Development approach. The WID approach was developed in the early 1970s by women from the West, Europeans, Americans, Scandinavians. In the second half of the 1970s, women from the non-West, so Africa, Latin America, Asia, began to advocate that the issues that the WID perspective took into account, or that the WID perspective dealt with, ignored the bigger issues of colonialism and unequal global relationships, that it was important to take these into account as well. So the WAD approach argues that women have always been a part of development, but that the work that they do is exploited to profit those in the global north. So women in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, when they work, the outcomes of their efforts are appreciated or are taken advantage of by those who live in the global north. And what this WAD approach then called for was an emphasis on increasing women's share in resources, land, employment, and income. WAD was much more concerned then about the relationship between women and development, how development as a project was taking undue advantage of women, particularly women from the South, as opposed to focusing on integrating women into development. Another way to think about this is that the WAD approach offered a critique of the development project, whereas the WAD approach did not really think about whether development as it existed was good or bad. They were much more interested in let's make sure that women are a part of development. Now, what has been said about WAD in terms of its negatives or the things that it doesn't take into account? One is that just like WAD, it doesn't take into account the fact that women are different. They have different class backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, and it's important to note that the impact of development, or if you say women in the global south are being exploited, that may be true of some of the women in the global south, but not all of the women in the global south. Also, because the WAD approach focuses on international relations of power, the differences in power between people who live in the global north and those who live in the global south, it ignores power differences within the global south, differences between men and women in the south, between rich and poor in the global south. This approach also argues that the desired transformational impact of WAD has not come to pass. And finally, because of the emphasis on promoting income-generating activities, not enough attention is paid to what happens within the domestic sphere, reproductive activities, or reproductive labor issues. The third major approach, the most recent one, the one that we commonly refer to now, because it's the one that most of us work with, is the gender and development approach. This was developed in the 1980s. And the key thing about the gender and development approach is that it focuses on the unequal relationships between men and women and seeks to transform this. So if you think back to the first session where we talked about practical gender needs versus strategic gender needs, the gender and development approach focuses on strategic gender needs, whereas the WAD approach focuses on practical gender needs. So GAD focuses not just on women, but on the social relations between men and women. It emphasizes the need for equal access of women and men to the control of resources, as well as to being able to benefit from whatever development offers to a citizenship or a country. This perspective analyzes what women do both within the domestic sphere and the public sphere. So it looks at unpaid domestic work as well as productive work. And it is the work of the GAD approach that has made it possible for us to conceptualize work within the domestic sphere as what we call care work that requires pay, just as work outside the domestic sphere gets paid. In other words, the GAD perspective recognizes the gender division of labor and the unequalness in that division of labor. The GAD perspective also puts responsibility on the state to provide the social services which have often been assumed to be taken care of by women. So all of the social reproduction roles that have been left to women to perform are now conceptualized as something that the government should be responsible for. So we have to think about children, for example, and the fact that their foundational years should be the priority of not just the parents involved, but states as well. How well a citizenry is educated is not just based on how much education they get at primary, secondary, and tertiary level. It also depends on their foundations, how good a foundation they have. And so to leave that to families to determine is not good enough. States should put in place mechanisms that ensure that when you go to kindergarten, there's some basics that all children get, regardless of where in the country they are born. The same thing applies to older people and sick people. We shouldn't be leaving the responsibility of caring for older people to families alone. The state should also be responsible for what happens to older people. Otherwise, it becomes the burden of women in families to take care of that, something that the GAD perspective argues should be the responsibility of the state. So in this approach, women are not just mere recipients of development, they are active agents in that process of development and in working to change the world as we see it and as we live it. The GAD model asserts that women experience oppression differently. So unlike the WAD and WAD perspective, that doesn't necessarily take differences between women into account, the GATT perspective recognizes that depending on your race, your class, your culture, your colonial history, your position in the global economic system would be different, and your approach to development would be different. Another important area which the GATT perspective draws on is what's come to be known as the gender law and development approach. This is a rights-based approach to development, and the aim here is to strengthen women's legal rights. So to use the law to ensure that women have equal access to the resources that men have traditionally had access to. So the GATT perspective, you can say, is the perspective interested in pursuing the strategic gender needs of women. So here you are with activities to undertake to help you better understand the differences between the WID, WAD, and GATT perspective.